The shadow of the gallows stretched long across Redemption's dusty Main Street, as Emma Wilson felt the cold steel of a gun barrel press against her spine. Her fingers still clutched the worn leather saddle she'd been caught trying to steal from outside the general store, her desperate gamble now seemingly her final mistake in a life full of them. "Thieving is hanging business in these parts, miss," the shop owner snarled, his voice carrying through the gathering crowd on that sweltering July afternoon in 1875. "Sheriff's on his way, but I reckon we might save him the trouble." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the faces of the townspeople, some curious, others wearing expressions of righteous anger. At 22, she hadn't expected her life to end like this, in a nameless Colorado mining town, all for a saddle she needed to continue her journey west. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "I was going to pay for it later. I just—" "Save your breath for the Lord," the man interrupted, pushing the gun harder against her back. "We don't take kindly to thieves, especially not ones that look like they ain't from around here." Just as the crowd began to close in, a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "She's mine. Let her go." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a man strode forward. Even from her position, Emma could feel his presence before she saw him, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His dark hair was partially hidden beneath a well-worn Stetson, and a star-shaped badge glinted on his chest. Maxwell Kane, the county sheriff, stood before her with eyes the color of storm clouds, his expression unreadable as he stared down the shop owner. "Sheriff Kane," the man holding Emma stammered, lowering his weapon slightly. "This woman was stealing my merchandise, caught her red-handed." Maxwell's gaze shifted to Emma, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in those stormy eyes, recognition, perhaps, or something deeper that she couldn't quite name. "I said, she's mine," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of authority that silenced the entire street. "I'll handle this. The rest of you go about your business." The shop owner reluctantly released his grip on Emma's arm and she stumbled forward, the saddle still clutched in her trembling hands. "This ain't right, Sheriff," the man protested. "Law's the law." "And I'm the law in these parts," Maxwell replied evenly, taking the saddle from Emma's hands and passing it back to the owner. "I'll see that proper restitution is made." He turned to Emma then, his expression stern but with something else hidden beneath the surface, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "Come with me, Miss Wilson." The fact that he knew her name sent a chill down her spine. She'd only arrived in Redemption 2 days ago and had spoken to barely anyone. As he led her away from the crowd, his hand firm but not unkind on her elbow, Emma realized her fate now rested in the hands of this enigmatic lawman who had just claimed her as his own. What she couldn't possibly know was that this moment, this chance encounter between a desperate woman and a sheriff with secrets of his own, would change both their lives forever, setting in motion a tale of redemption, danger, and a love as wild and untamed as the frontier itself. Maxwell guided Emma down the dusty street, his grip on her arm loosening once they were away from the crowd. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked in tense silence toward the jailhouse, a sturdy building of rough-hewn timber with barred windows, and a hitching post out front where his chestnut gelding stood waiting. "How do you know my name?" Emma finally asked, finding her voice as they approached the building. Maxwell's jaw tightened. "I make it my business to know everyone who passes through Redemption, especially those who might cause trouble." He opened the door to the jailhouse and ushered her inside. The interior was surprisingly clean and orderly, a desk with neatly stacked papers, 3 cells along the back wall, all empty, and a small stove in the corner that provided warmth on colder days. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to a wooden chair across from his desk. Emma complied, her eyes never leaving his face as he removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door. Without the shadow of the brim, she could see him more clearly, a handsome man in his early 30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. "You want to tell me why you were stealing a saddle in broad daylight?" Maxwell asked, settling into the chair behind his desk and fixing her with a penetrating gaze. Emma straightened her spine. "I needed it to continue my journey. I have money coming. I would have paid for it eventually." "Eventually doesn't cut it with merchants who need to feed their families today," he replied. "Where are you headed in such a hurry that you'd risk your neck for a saddle?" She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "California. I have family waiting there." Something in his expression told her he didn't believe her, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with those stormy eyes. "You're running from something, Miss Wilson. Or someone." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that hit too close to home. Emma felt her cheeks flush, partly from anger at his presumption and partly because he was right. "My reasons are my own, Sheriff." Maxwell nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But in my town, we follow the law. No exceptions, no matter how desperate the circumstances." "Then why did you intervene?" Emma challenged. "Why tell them I was yours when we've never met?" A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed his face. "Would you rather I had let them string you up?" "Because that's what would have happened. Folks around here have seen too many thieves and outlaws pass through. They're quick to judgment and quicker to the rope." Emma swallowed hard, the reality of how close she'd come to death settling over her like a cold shroud. "No. Thank you for that, at least." Maxwell stood and walked to a small cabinet, retrieving a tin cup which he filled with water from a pitcher. He placed it before her, his fingers brushing hers briefly as she accepted it. "Drink. Then we'll discuss how you're going to make this right." Emma took a sip, grateful for the cool water against her parched throat. "I told you I don't have money right now, but I don't want your money," Maxwell interrupted. "What I need is information." Her grip tightened on the cup. "Information about what? About the man who's following you?" Emma nearly dropped the cup, water sloshing over the rim and onto her dust-covered skirt. "What do you know about that?" Maxwell's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a knowing look that sent a shiver down her spine. "Enough to know he's dangerous. Enough to know you're not the only one he's hunting." Her mind raced with possibilities. How could this sheriff in a small mining town know about Marcus Fletcher, the man she'd been fleeing from for the past 3 months? The man whose proposal she'd rejected, only to discover too late the depths of his obsession and cruelty. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk. "Yes, you do. And if you want my help, if you want to leave redemption alive, you'll start being honest with me." The intensity in his gaze made it impossible to look away. Emma felt as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed walls to the fear that had been her constant companion since fleeing her home in St. Louis. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. For the first time since they'd entered the jailhouse, Maxwell's expression softened slightly. "You don't. But right now, Miss Wilson, I'm the only friend you've got in this town, and from what I gather, you're in desperate need of friends." The truth of his words hung in the air between them. Emma took another sip of water, using the moment to collect her thoughts. She'd spent months trusting no one, telling half-truths and outright lies to protect herself. The thought of confiding in this stranger, this lawman with knowing eyes and a reputation for upholding justice, terrified her almost as much as the man she was running from. Almost, but not quite. "His name is Marcus Fletcher," she finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. "He's wealthy, respected in St. Louis society, and completely obsessed with possessing me. When I refused his proposal, Her voice faltered. "Go on," Maxwell encouraged, his tone gentler now. "He destroyed my reputation, made it impossible for me to find work or shelter. When that wasn't enough to make me accept his offer, he became violent." Emma unconsciously touched her wrist, where the faint yellow remnants of a bruise still lingered. "I fled in the night 3 months ago. He's been tracking me ever since." Maxwell's expression darkened. "And the saddle?" "My horse went lame 2 towns back. I've been traveling by stagecoach, but Fletcher has connections with the stage companies. It's how he's been following my trail. I thought if I could buy a horse here, travel cross-country instead of along the main routes." She shrugged. "But when I arrived, I discovered my money had been stolen somewhere along the way. The saddle was my last desperate attempt to keep moving." Maxwell nodded slowly, as if her story confirmed something he already suspected. "Fletcher arrived in Silverton yesterday. That's a half-day's ride from here." Emma's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" "I have my sources," he replied cryptically. "What matters is that you don't have much time." "Then I need to leave now," Emma said, rising from her chair. "I appreciate your help, Sheriff Kane, but I can't stay here, not if he's that close." Maxwell stood as well, his imposing height blocking her path to the door. "Running hasn't worked so far. What makes you think it will work now?" "It's kept me alive," she countered. "Barely." His eyes held hers unwavering. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Wilson." Emma tensed. She'd heard those words before, from men who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. What kind of proposition? Something akin to understanding crossed Maxwell's face. "Not that kind. I'm offering you protection, but I need something in return." "What could I possibly have that would be of value to you?" Maxwell walked to a wanted poster, tacked to the wall a crude sketch of a man with cold eyes and a thin mustache. The name beneath the image read Marcus Fletcher and listed charges of fraud, assault, and suspected murder. "Fletcher isn't just after you," Maxwell explained, tapping the poster. "He's wanted in 3 territories for crimes that go well beyond obsession with a woman. I've been tracking him for months, but he's clever, always 1 step ahead." He turned back to face her. "Until now." Understanding dawned on Emma. "You want to use me as bait." "I want to use you as an ally," he corrected. "Help me catch him, and I'll ensure you're free of him forever. You'll have my protection every step of the way." Emma laughed bitterly. "And I'm supposed to trust that you can protect me from a man who has connections in every major city from here to the Mississippi? A man who's eluded capture for months, if not years." Maxwell stepped closer, close enough that Emma could smell the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him. "Yes," he said simply. "Because unlike the other lawmen he's encountered, I have personal reasons for wanting to see Fletcher brought to justice." "What reasons?" A shadow passed over Maxwell's face, and for a moment Emma glimpsed a deep well of pain behind his composed exterior. "My sister," he said quietly. "Fletcher ruined her much as he tried to ruin you, only she didn't escape. She took her own life rather than live with the shame he brought upon her." Emma's heart constricted at the raw emotion in his voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry, be smart." Maxwell's intensity was palpable. "Help me stop him from doing this to anyone else." The weight of his request settled on her shoulders. What he was proposing was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but for the first time in months, Emma felt something besides fear, purpose. "What exactly would I have to do?" she asked cautiously. "Stay in town, be seen." Let word reach Fletcher that you're here." Maxwell outlined his plan with the precision of a man who had thought it through carefully. "But you won't be alone, not for a single moment. And after, if we succeed, then you're free to go wherever you please, California if that's what you truly want." He studied her face. "Though I suspect that was never really your destination." Emma met his gaze steadily. "No, it wasn't." A ghost of a smile touched Maxwell's lips. "So we have an agreement." She should say no. Every instinct honed through months of running screamed at her to flee this town before nightfall. And yet, there was something about Maxwell Kane, something in the steadfast determination in his eyes and the quiet confidence in his manner that made her want to believe in him. "We have an agreement," Emma said, extending her hand. Maxwell's larger hand enveloped hers, warm and calloused from years of hard work. The contact sent an unexpected spark through Emma's veins, and from the slight widening of Maxwell's eyes, she suspected he felt it too. "Well then, Miss Wilson," he said, his voice a touch rougher than before. "Let's get to work." Neither of them could have predicted the storm that was coming, a tempest of danger and desire that would test them both to their limits and forge between them a bond stronger than either had ever known. As dusk settled over Redemption, Maxwell led Emma from the jailhouse toward the far end of town. The streets had quieted, with most townsfolk retreating to their homes or gathering at the saloon for evening refreshments. They walked side by side, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, sending little jolts of awareness through Emma each time. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "My home," Maxwell replied, guiding her down a side street. "It's the safest place for you tonight." Emma stopped abruptly. "Your home, Sheriff Kane, I don't think. It's not what you're thinking," he interrupted, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'll be taking the spare room at the back of the jailhouse tonight. You'll have my house to yourself." Embarrassed by her assumption, Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Oh, I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken," Maxwell assured her, continuing their walk. "But we need to maintain appearances if we're going to convince Fletcher you're unprotected. That means you'll need to be seen around town, seemingly on your own." "While you watch from the shadows," Emma guessed. Maxwell nodded. "Me or one of the few men I trust in this town, Deputy Collins and a former ranger named Holt. They'll be briefed tomorrow." They turned onto a narrow path that led to a modest but well-maintained cabin at the edge of town. A small corral stood to one side, currently empty, and a garden of herbs and vegetables grew along the southern wall. It was simple but welcoming, far from what Emma had expected of a bachelor sheriff's dwelling. Maxwell unlocked the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, bookshelves filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind, and a rocking chair by the window. A curtained doorway presumably led to the bedroom. "It's lovely," Emma said honestly, taking in the unexpected hominess of the place. "It was my parents' home," Maxwell explained, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow throughout the room. "They both passed on 5 years ago. Fever took them within days of each other. I've kept it much as they left it." The personal revelation surprised Emma. It was the first truly personal information he had shared without prompting. "You were close to them." "Very." Maxwell moved to the fireplace, kneeling to start a small fire against the evening chill. "My father was the sheriff before me. Taught me everything I know about the law and about justice, not always the same thing, as he used to say." As the flames caught and began to dance among the kindling, Emma saw Maxwell's profile illuminated in the firelight's strong jaw, straight nose, the scar that marked his otherwise handsome face. There was a gentleness to his movements that contradicted his imposing presence, a care in how he handled even the simplest tasks. "And your mother?" Emma asked, settling into one of the wooden chairs. Maxwell smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face and made him look younger. "She was the real authority in our household, ran the town's only school for 20 years, taught half the citizens of Redemption their letters and numbers." He stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "She would have liked you. How could you possibly know that?" Emma challenged, though she felt oddly pleased by the assessment. "Because you're a survivor," he said simply. "My mother always admired those who faced adversity with courage." The compliment warmed Emma more than the fire. It had been so long since anyone had seen anything in her worthy of admiration. Maxwell moved to a cabinet and pulled out a loaf of bread, some cheese and dried fruit. "It's not much, but it should tide you over until morning. I'll bring proper supplies tomorrow." "This is more than enough," Emma assured him, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast at dawn. As Maxwell arranged the food on a plate for her, Emma noticed a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Rising from her chair, she moved closer to examine it. A family portrait, a younger Maxwell, perhaps 20, standing beside a striking young woman with the same storm-gray eyes. Behind them, an older couple with kind faces and proud expressions. "Your sister?" Emma asked softly, studying the young woman's face. Maxwell paused in his task, his expression shadowed. "Yes, Meredith." Emma gently touched the frame. "She was beautiful." "She was brilliant," Maxwell corrected, though not unkindly. "Had a mind sharper than any man I've ever known, could have done anything with her life." The grief in his voice was palpable, a wound still raw despite the passage of time. Emma turned to face him, understanding now the depth of his determination to capture Fletcher. "How long ago?" she asked. 3 years. Maxwell placed the plate of food on the table. Fletcher was passing through on business, or so he claimed. In reality, he was running a confidence scheme, cheating minors out of their claims. Meredith was teaching by then, having taken over the school after our mother passed. She discovered what he was doing and threatened to expose him. Emma returned to the table, but her appetite had diminished, and instead of running, he turned his attention to her. Maxwell nodded grimly. He courted her publicly while ruining her privately. Spread rumors, planted evidence of impropriety, even paid a young man to claim he'd compromised her virtue. By the time I realized what was happening, the damage was done. The town turned against her, the school board dismissed her, and Fletcher disappeared with his ill-gotten gains. "And she couldn't bear the shame," Emma whispered, remembering his earlier words. "I found her." The simple statement contained volumes of pain. "I'd been tracking a horse thief for 3 days when I returned." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Without thinking, Emma reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "It wasn't your fault." Maxwell's fingers tightened around hers briefly before he withdrew his hand. "Perhaps not, but I made a vow that day Fletcher would face justice for what he did. I've been hunting him ever since, following reports of similar schemes across the territories, always just a step behind." "Until now," Emma said. "Until now," he agreed, his gaze intense. "Because this time he's not hunting a claim or a scheme, he's hunting you." The weight of that reality settled over Emma like a shroud. "Why me? I'm nobody, just a seamstress from St. Louis with no family, no fortune." "Some men don't need a reason beyond the challenge," Maxwell replied. "You rejected him. In his mind, that makes you a prize to be won, by any means necessary." Emma shuddered, knowing he was right. The few letters Fletcher had managed to send her way during her months of running had grown increasingly possessive and threatening, speaking of her as if she were already his property. "Eat," Maxwell encouraged, gesturing to the untouched food. "You'll need your strength." Emma complied, forcing herself to take small bites despite her churning stomach. Maxwell moved about the cabin, gathering a few personal items into a small bag, presumably things he would need for his night at the jailhouse. "There are clean linens on the bed," he told her, "and water in the pitcher for washing. The door has a solid bolt. Use it after I leave. Don't open for anyone but me, and even then not until you're certain it's me." "How will I know?" Emma asked. Maxwell considered this. "I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. Anyone else, no matter what they say, you stay silent and hidden." Emma nodded, committing the signal to memory. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we begin to set the trap," Maxwell replied, shouldering his small bag. "I'll return at first light, try to get some rest." As he moved toward the door, Emma felt a sudden panic at the thought of being alone. "Sheriff Kane," she called. He turned, one hand on the doorknob. "Yes." Emma searched for something to say that wouldn't reveal her fear. "Thank you for believing me, for helping me." Maxwell's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Maxwell," he said, "if we're going to convince Fletcher and the town that there's something between us, you should call me Maxwell, at least when we're alone." The intimacy of using his given name sent an unexpected flutter through Emma's chest. "Maxwell," she repeated, testing the feel of it on her tongue. He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good night, Emma." Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Emma immediately rose and slid the heavy bolt into place, then checked that the windows were securely latched. Alone in the sheriff's cabin, surrounded by the remnants of his family's life and the lingering scent of leather and pine that seemed to follow him, Emma felt both more vulnerable and more protected than she had in months. She ate a little more, the simple food tasting better than she'd expected, then explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bedroom beyond the curtained doorway was neat and masculine, a large bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and another small bookshelf. On the nightstand sat a leather-bound volume that, upon inspection, proved to be a journal filled with Maxwell's neat, precise handwriting. Emma quickly closed it, respecting his privacy despite her curiosity about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. After washing her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher, she hesitated only briefly before removing her outer clothing and slipping beneath the quilt in her chemise and underskirt. The bed was comfortable, the sheets clean and smelling faintly of lavender, his mother's influence, perhaps. As exhaustion finally overtook her, Emma's last conscious thought was of Maxwell's storm-gray eyes and the unexpected sense of safety she felt knowing he was out there, standing guard against the darkness that had been pursuing her for so long. What she couldn't know was that Maxwell Kane, sitting in the empty jailhouse with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, was thinking of her as well, of her courage in the face of terror, of the soft touch of her hand on his, and of the strange feeling that by saving Emma Wilson, he might somehow find redemption for failing to save his sister. Neither of them slept well that night, each haunted by ghosts of the past and uncertainties about the future, but both drawing a measure of comfort from the knowledge that, for the first time in a long while, neither of them was facing their demons alone. Dawn broke over redemption with streaks of gold and crimson painting the horizon. Emma had been awake for over an hour, having slept fitfully through the night. Every creak of the cabin's timber, every whisper of wind against the windows had jolted her from sleep, her mind conjuring images of Fletcher finding her, his cold eyes and cruel smile looming in the darkness. She had dressed in the same travel-worn clothes from the previous day, wishing she had access to fresh garments, but knowing it was the least of her concerns. Her hair, once her pride with its rich auburn color and natural wave, had been hastily braided and tucked beneath a plain bonnet, part of her ongoing attempt to alter her appearance as she fled from town to town. The promised knock came just as the sun cleared the distant mountains. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she slid back the bolt and opened the door. Maxwell stood on the threshold, looking surprisingly fresh for a man who had presumably spent the night in a hard chair at the jailhouse. He carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and a small carpet bag. "Good morning," he greeted her, his voice low and warm. "May I come in?" Emma stepped aside, noting the way his eyes quickly scanned her face, likely assessing whether she had slept. "Good morning," she returned, closing the door behind him. Maxwell placed his burdens on the table. "I brought breakfast," he said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal fresh bread, a jar of preserves and several hard-boiled eggs, "and some things you might need." He opened the carpet bag and withdrew a folded dress of deep blue calico, simple but clean and well-made, along with other feminine necessities: a hairbrush, a small bar of lavender soap, even a ribbon for her hair. Emma stared at the items in surprise. "Where did you get these, Mrs. Henderson?" "At the Mercantile," Maxwell explained, setting a pot of coffee on the stove to heat. "She's a widow, about your size and discreet. I told her I needed some things for a female witness under protection." "And she didn't ask questions?" Maxwell's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Of course she did. But she's also the biggest gossip in town, which makes her perfect for our purposes. By noon, everyone will be speculating about the mysterious woman staying at the sheriff's house." Emma picked up the dress, running her fingers over the sturdy fabric. "It's lovely." "Please thank her for me." "You can thank her yourself," Maxwell replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Part of our plan involves establishing you in town. You'll need to be seen to become known to the townspeople." "As who?" Emma asked, accepting the cup he offered. "A witness." Maxwell hesitated, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of his cup. "As my intended." Emma nearly choked on her coffee. "Your what, my intended?" "My fiancée." Maxwell remained perfectly serious. "It's the only explanation that would justify your presence in my home and my obvious protection of you. Any other story would raise too many questions, create too many variables." "But," Emma sputtered, setting down her cup with more force than necessary, "people will never believe that." "Why not?" There was a challenge in his voice. Emma gestured vaguely between them. Because we're strangers. Because you're the sheriff and I'm a woman who was caught stealing just yesterday. Because courtships take time and engagements aren't announced overnight." "Not necessarily," Maxwell countered, leaning against the stove with an ease that belied the tension Emma felt building in her chest. "This is the frontier, Emma. Practical arrangements between men and women happen quickly out here. Widowers remarry within weeks. Mail-order brides step off stagecoaches and into marriage. A whirlwind courtship resulting in a hasty engagement is unusual, perhaps, but not unbelievable." Emma paced the small room, trying to organize her thoughts. "But what happens after, when Fletcher is caught?" "The entire town will think we're to be married. We'll say you had second thoughts, or that I did." Maxwell shrugged. "People will gossip for a week, then move on to the next scandal." His matter-of-fact attitude both impressed and infuriated Emma. "And you're comfortable lying to everyone you know, to people who trust you as their sheriff." Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes, a brief shadow of doubt or regret. "To catch Fletcher? Yes, I would do far more than tell a few lies." The intensity of his conviction silenced Emma's objections. This wasn't simply about upholding the law for him. It was personal, a quest for justice that went beyond his badge. Who was she to question his methods when he was risking so much to help her? "All right," she conceded with a sigh. "How did we meet?" Maxwell's expression relaxed slightly, and he moved to sit at the table, gesturing for her to join him. 3 months ago in Denver. You were working as a seamstress in a shop that made a shirt for me while I was there on business for the county." "That's actually not far from the truth," Emma admitted, taking the seat across from him. "I did work in a dress shop in Denver for 2 weeks before Fletcher's men found me there." "The best lies contain elements of truth," Maxwell said, spreading preserves on a slice of bread and offering it to her. "We corresponded after I returned to Redemption. When you found yourself in trouble, we'll be vague about the nature of that trouble. You came to me for help. I proposed marriage as a solution, partly out of genuine affection and partly to offer you the protection of my name." Emma accepted the bread, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "And I accepted, despite having known you for such a short time, because I was desperate and had no other options." Maxwell frowned slightly. "Not how I would have phrased it, but essentially, yes." "It's not very romantic," Emma observed, taking a small bite of the bread. The sweet tang of blackberry preserves filled her mouth, reminding her of simpler times. "It doesn't need to be romantic. It needs to be believable." "Romance can be believable," Emma countered. "Perhaps more so than a cold arrangement between virtual strangers." Maxwell studied her for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "You're right," he finally said. "The town knows me as reserved but not unfeeling. A purely practical arrangement would raise more questions than a love match." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "So we met in Denver. You were making alterations to a suit I needed for a territorial governor's meeting. We spoke. I was captivated by your intelligence and beauty." His voice had softened, taking on a quality Emma hadn't heard before. "I called on you several times during my stay. We walked in the park. Perhaps I bought you a small gift, a book of poetry, since you mentioned loving Wordsworth." Emma found herself caught up in the fiction he was weaving, the simple bread and preserves forgotten in her hand. "And after you left, we exchanged letters. You wrote about redemption, about your work. I wrote about my dreams of a quieter life, away from the city." Maxwell nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "When trouble found you, I was the person you turned to. I sent money for your stagecoach passage and waited anxiously for your arrival." "But something went wrong," Emma continued, falling naturally into the role. "My money was stolen along the way. I arrived with nothing but the clothes on my back, too proud to immediately seek you out in such a state. I tried to acquire what I needed to present myself properly, and were caught in a desperate act by people who didn't know your connection to me," Maxwell finished. "Until I stepped in and claimed you." The narrative hung between them, surprisingly cohesive and, Emma had to admit, not entirely unbelievable. There was something almost wistful in Maxwell's expression as he outlined their fictitious courtship, as if he were imagining how such a relationship might actually have unfolded under different circumstances. "You think people will believe it?" Emma asked softly. "They'll believe what they see," Maxwell replied, "which means we'll need to be convincing. Public displays of affection, the way we look at each other, how we speak to one another, all of it matters." The implication of his words sent a rush of heat to Emma's cheeks. "You mean we'll have to touch in public?" Maxwell's lips quirked in that almost smile again. "Nothing scandalous. A hand at your elbow, perhaps your arm through mine as we walk. Maybe." He hesitated briefly. "A chaste kiss if the situation demands it." Emma swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of Maxwell as a man rather than simply as her protector. He was handsome in a rugged way, with those penetrating gray eyes and strong features. The thought of his lips on hers, even in pretense, sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. "I see," she managed, looking down at her half-eaten bread. "If that makes you uncomfortable," Maxwell began. "No," Emma interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "No, I understand the necessity. We need to be convincing." Maxwell nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "Good. Now eat your breakfast. We have a busy day ahead." As they finished their meal in companionable silence, Emma found herself studying Maxwell covertly, noting the way the morning light highlighted the silver strands at his temples, the careful precision with which he ate, the strength in his hands as he poured more coffee. He was a man of contradictions, stern yet kind, reserved yet passionate about justice, formal in speech yet capable of genuine warmth. What kind of man, she wondered, devoted years of his life to avenging his sister? What kind of lawman risked his reputation and career to help a woman he barely knew? And what would happen when their charade was over, when Fletcher was captured and the danger passed? These questions circled in Emma's mind as she prepared for the day ahead, changing into the blue calico dress and allowing herself the small luxury of brushing her hair properly for the first time in days. As she arranged it in a simpler style than her usual severe braid, leaving some of the auburn waves to frame her face, she told herself it was part of their deception. The alleged fiancée of Sheriff Kane would take care with her appearance. But a small, honest part of her acknowledged the truth. She wanted to look nice for Maxwell, wanted to see that subtle appreciation in his eyes that she'd glimpsed briefly when he spoke of being captivated by her in their fictional meeting. It was foolish, she knew. Dangerous, even, to develop any sort of attachment to the man who was using her as bait in a deadly game. But after months of running, of trusting no one, the simple human connection, even one built on an elaborate lie, felt like water to a woman dying of thirst. When she emerged from the bedroom, Maxwell was waiting by the door, his hat in his hands. He looked up as she approached, and the brief widening of his eyes, the quick intake of breath that he couldn't quite conceal, gave Emma a small, forbidden thrill of satisfaction. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you," Emma replied, smoothing the skirt of the dress. "I'm ready." Maxwell offered his arm, his expression once again composed. "Remember," he said quietly, "from the moment we step outside, we're engaged to be married." Every word, every look, every touch must support that story. Emma placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve. "I understand." "And no matter what happens," Maxwell added, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he opened the door, "no matter what you see or hear, trust that I won't let any harm come to you. That's not part of the charade, Emma. That's a promise." The sincerity in his eyes stole Emma's breath more effectively than any embrace could have. She nodded, unable to form words around the sudden tightness in her throat. As they stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, arm in arm like any couple about to begin their day, Emma felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were setting a trap for a dangerous man, risking everything on an elaborate deception. But for the first time since she'd fled St. Louis in the dead of night, Emma didn't feel like prey. Standing beside Maxwell Kane, she felt like a hunter. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps the greatest danger wasn't Fletcher at all, but the growing attachment she felt to the man, whose arm she held, an attachment that had no place in their carefully constructed lie. The morning sun climbed higher as Maxwell and Emma walked arm in arm down Redemption's Main Street. Emma felt the weight of curious stares from every porch and storefront. News traveled fast in small towns, and her presence at the sheriff's side, wearing a new dress and looking considerably more presentable than the day before, had clearly set tongues wagging. "People are staring," she murmured, fighting the urge to duck her head. "Let them," Maxwell replied, his voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm proud to be seen with my future wife." The declaration, though part of their ruse, sent a ripple of warmth through Emma. Maxwell played his role with a conviction that was almost too convincing, his hand occasionally covering hers where it rested on his arm, his gaze softening whenever it fell upon her face. Their first stop was the general store, where Emma had attempted to steal the saddle the previous day. Maxwell pushed open the door, a small bell announcing their arrival. The shop owner, a burly man with mutton chop whiskers, looked up from his ledger and frowned. "Sheriff Kane," he acknowledged stiffly, his disapproving gaze shifting to Emma. "And the thief, Mr. Dawson," Maxwell replied evenly. "I'd like to introduce Miss Emma Wilson, my fiancée." The shopkeeper's jaw dropped comically. "Your what, my fiancée?" Maxwell repeated, his arm sliding around Emma's waist in a protective gesture. "Who, I should mention, has come to make proper restitution for yesterday's unfortunate incident." Emma stepped forward, channeling every ounce of contrition she could muster. "Mr. Dawson, I cannot adequately express my regret for yesterday's misunderstanding. I arrived in town to join my intended," she glanced lovingly at Maxwell, "but found myself in difficult circumstances when my traveling funds were stolen en route." "Misunderstanding," Dawson sputtered. "You were stealing my merchandise." "She was desperate and ashamed," Maxwell interjected smoothly. "Too proud to come to me immediately in such a state. Emma had written to me of her situation, but I'd expected her to arrive with the funds I sent ahead. When those were stolen, she made a terrible decision in a moment of panic." Emma lowered her eyes, allowing a genuine flush of embarrassment to color her cheeks. "It was inexcusable, sir. I offer my sincere apology and, of course, payment for any inconvenience caused." Maxwell placed several coins on the counter, far more than the saddle was worth. Dawson eyed the money, his expression caught between lingering outrage and mercenary calculation. "Well," he finally said, scooping up the coins, "I suppose if the sheriff vouches for you and with proper payment made." He harumphed, still clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to alienate the town's law enforcement. "No lasting harm done, I reckon." "You're most gracious," Emma said, offering a small, humble smile. Maxwell nodded his approval. "Now we'll be needing a few supplies." Emma arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back, and we're looking to set up our household properly before the wedding. For the next half hour, they selected basic necessities: clothing, toiletries, cooking supplies, with Maxwell insisting on the best quality Dawson had to offer. Throughout their shopping, he maintained physical contact with Emma whenever possible, a hand at the small of her back, fingers brushing hers as they examined items together, a tender tucking of a stray hair behind her ear. Each touch, though performed for their audience, sent sparks of awareness through Emma's body. By the time they left the store, Dawson's initial hostility had transformed into the particular obsequiousness reserved for valued customers. He promised delivery of their larger purchases to the sheriff's cabin and offered his congratulations on their engagement, albeit with a lingering hint of suspicion in his eyes. "One down," Maxwell murmured as they stepped back onto the boardwalk. "Word will spread quickly now." "He didn't seem entirely convinced," Emma whispered back, maintaining her smile for any onlookers. "Dawson's a skeptic by nature," Maxwell assured her, "but he's also a businessman. Our money spends as well as anyone's." He checked the position of the sun. It's nearly time for the morning stage. Let's make an appearance at the hotel dining room for coffee. The new arrivals will see us together, and the hotel staff are second only to Mrs. Henderson when it comes to gossip. As they walked toward the Grand Hotel, a name far more impressive than the two-story wooden structure deserved, Maxwell greeted various townspeople, introducing Emma to each with obvious pride. She played her part, smiling demurely and expressing delight at finally arriving in the town she'd heard so much about in Maxwell's letters. Inside the hotel's small dining room, they were shown to a table near the window, a prime location for being observed by both the room's occupants and passers-by on the street. The waitress, a young woman named Betsy, nearly dropped her coffee pot when Maxwell introduced Emma as his intended. "Well, I never," she exclaimed, her round face alight with curiosity. "Sheriff Kane, you dark horse, never breathing a word about a sweetheart, and here you are engaged." Maxwell actually smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face and made Emma's heart skip a beat. "Some matters are too precious to be subjected to town gossip, Betsy." The girl blushed, pouring their coffee with slightly unsteady hands. "How did you two meet, if you don't mind my asking?" Emma launched into their practice story, embellishing slightly with details about the Denver dress shop and Maxwell's kindness during their brief acquaintance there. She described their correspondence with convincing fondness, even mentioning the fictional book of Wordsworth poems he had given her. "It was when I read his letters that I truly fell in love," Emma confided, reaching across the table to take Maxwell's hand. "He has a way with words that reveals his heart." Maxwell's thumb stroked the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "And I fell in love with her courage," he added, the low timbre of his voice sending a shiver down Emma's spine. "Her determination to make her own way in the world, despite obstacles." The tenderness in his expression seemed too real to be feigned, and for a moment, Emma found herself wishing that the story they wove so convincingly were true. Betsy sighed dreamily. "That's just lovely. When's the wedding to be?" "Soon," Maxwell replied, finally breaking his gaze from Emma's to address the waitress. "As soon as proper arrangements can be made. We see no reason to wait." "Well, congratulations to you both," Betsy gushed before hurrying off to share the news with the kitchen staff. When she was gone, Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You're very convincing," she murmured, sipping her coffee to hide her flustered state. "As are you," Maxwell returned, his voice pitched low so only she could hear. "Though I'm not sure Wordsworth was the right choice. I've always been more partial to Tennyson myself." The casual revelation, a genuine personal preference slipped into their pretense, caught Emma by surprise. She found herself wondering how many of Maxwell's words and actions were purely performance, and how many contained kernels of truth. Before she could ponder this further, the distant sound of the stagecoach's arrival drew their attention. Maxwell placed coins on the table for their coffee and offered Emma his arm once more. "Let's greet the new arrivals," he suggested. "The more people who see us together, the faster our story will spread." They walked to the stagecoach landing just as the dust-covered vehicle rumbled to a stop. The driver tossed down mailbags while passengers began to disembark, a traveling salesman, an older couple, and a young man in an expensive but trail-worn suit. Maxwell's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly as the young man stepped down. "Thomas Fletcher," he muttered under his breath. "Marcus's younger brother." Emma's blood ran cold. "Fletcher is here," she whispered, her fingers digging into Maxwell's arm. "Not Marcus." "Not yet," Maxwell assured her, his voice calm despite the tension Emma could feel in his body. "But Thomas's presence means he's close, very close." Thomas Fletcher was handsome in a polished way, with the same cold eyes Emma remembered from his brother. He surveyed the town with obvious disdain before his gaze landed on Maxwell and Emma. For a moment, confusion crossed his features, followed by a flash of recognition as he looked at Emma. "Keep smiling," Maxwell instructed quietly. "Let him see how happy we are." Emma forced her lips into a convincing smile, leaning into Maxwell's side as if she couldn't bear to be separated from him. Maxwell played his part perfectly, bending to whisper something in her ear, nonsense words about staying calm that to observers would appear to be a lover's endearment. Thomas Fletcher approached them, his own smile not reaching his eyes. "Sheriff Kane," he greeted Maxwell, tipping his hat. "What a pleasant surprise, Mr. Fletcher," Maxwell replied coolly. "Business brings you to redemption, family business, you might say." Thomas's gaze shifted to Emma, assessment in his eyes. "And who is this lovely lady?" Maxwell's arm tightened around Emma's waist. "My fiancée, Miss Emma Wilson, soon to be Mrs. Kane." Emma extended her hand with a grace she didn't feel. "Mr. Fletcher, a pleasure." Thomas took her hand, holding it a moment longer than propriety dictated. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Wilson, or should I say the surprise is mine. I had no idea the good sheriff was engaged to be married." "A recent development," Maxwell said, smoothly reclaiming Emma's hand and tucking it into the crook of his arm. "But when you find the right woman, why wait?" Thomas's smile thinned. "Indeed. My brother shares that philosophy, as it happens. He's quite the romantic, falls deeply in love, and pursues his heart's desire with unwavering dedication." The threat beneath the pleasant words was unmistakable. Emma felt Maxwell's muscles tense beneath her fingers but marveled at his outward composure. "How fortunate for the objects of his affection," Maxwell remarked dryly. "Will your brother be joining you in redemption?" Thomas chuckled, a sound without warmth. "Oh, I expect he'll turn up very soon. He has business in the area that's become quite pressing." His gaze lingered on Emma. "I'm sure he'll be interested to meet your fiancé. He has an eye for beauty." "Then we look forward to making his acquaintance," Maxwell replied, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have wedding preparations to attend to." "Of course." Thomas tipped his hat again. "I wouldn't dream of keeping the happy couple, Miss Wilson, Sheriff Kane." As Thomas walked toward the hotel, Emma released a shaky breath. "He knows," she whispered. "He recognized me." "Yes," Maxwell agreed grimly. "And he'll send word to his brother immediately." "What do we do now?" Maxwell guided her away from the stagecoach landing, his expression thoughtful. "We continue as planned. Thomas's arrival actually works in our favor. It means Fletcher is close, probably within a day's ride. The trap is baited. Now we wait for him to spring it." Emma glanced back at the hotel, a shiver running through her despite the warm day. "And if he decides to act through his brother?" "Thomas is already here, already a threat." "Thomas Fletcher is many things, but he's not a killer," Maxwell assured her. "He's the respectable face of the family's operations, the one who negotiates contracts and handles legal matters. He won't risk his own neck." "You seem to know a lot about the Fletchers." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "I've made it my business to know everything about them. 3 years of hunting a man teaches you his habits, his weaknesses, the people he trusts." They continued down the street, maintaining their loving facade while speaking in low, urgent tones. Maxwell outlined the next steps in their plan. They would spend the day being seen around town, reinforcing their engagement story. In the evening, they would attend dinner at the hotel, making sure Thomas Fletcher witnessed their apparent happiness. "And tonight?" Emma asked, aware of the intimate implications of the question. Maxwell met her gaze directly. "Tonight you'll stay at my cabin again." I'll take the room at the jailhouse as before." His expression softened slightly. "Unless you'd prefer other arrangements, I could ask Mrs. Henderson to put you up." "No," Emma interrupted, surprised by her own vehemence. "No, your cabin is safer. I trust your judgment." Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or something warmer. "Thank you for that trust. It's not given lightly, I know." As they continued their charade throughout the day, Emma found herself thinking less about the danger they faced and more about the man at her side. Despite the artifice of their situation, there were moments when Maxwell's tenderness seemed genuine, the protective way he kept her close, the occasional unguarded smile, the thoughtful attention to her comfort. By late afternoon, when they strolled through Redemption's small park, Emma realized with a start that she was no longer entirely acting. The warmth she felt when Maxwell took her hand, the flutter in her stomach when he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, these were real feelings, dangerous in their authenticity. As they sat on a bench beneath a cottonwood tree, ostensibly taking in the late afternoon air but actually watching for any sign of the Fletcher brothers, Emma found herself studying Maxwell's profile against the golden light. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly, keeping her voice low. Maxwell turned to her, brows drawing together slightly. "What do you mean? Something about yourself? Something real, not part of our story?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "If I'm trusting you with my life, I should know something genuine about the man behind the badge." Maxwell was silent for a long moment, considering her request. Finally, he shifted on the bench, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that sent warmth through her despite the cooling evening air. "I wanted to be a lawyer once," he said quietly. "Studied for it in Denver for 2 years. Had dreams of arguing before the territorial Supreme Court, maybe even in Washington someday." The admission surprised Emma. "What changed?" A shadow crossed Maxwell's face. "My father was ambushed by cattle rustlers, shot in the back while serving papers on a remote ranch. By the time I got home, he was already buried, and my mother was trying to hold things together." He looked down at his hands, strong and calloused from years far removed from courtrooms and legal briefs. "The town needed a sheriff. I knew the law. It seemed like fate. Do you regret it?" Emma asked softly. "The path not taken." Maxwell considered this, his gaze drifting to the darkening sky. "Sometimes, in quiet moments, but then I remember the good I've done here, the families protected, the justice served. It's a different kind of law than I imagined practicing, but perhaps a more direct one." The honesty in his answer touched Emma deeply. She had expected some small personal preference, a favorite food, perhaps, or a childhood memory. Instead, he had shared a fundamental turning point in his life, a dream surrendered for duty and family. "Thank you," she said simply. Maxwell's eyes returned to hers, a question in them. "For what?" "For something true." A small smile touched his lips, genuine and unguarded. "Your turn," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper as an elderly couple walked past their bench. "Tell me something true about Emma Wilson." Emma hesitated, conscious of how little she had shared of herself since fleeing St. Louis. She had become adept at crafting half-truths and evasions, revealing only what was necessary to survive. "I never wanted to be a seamstress," she finally admitted. "I took the position because it was respectable and available to a woman alone, but my real passion was always for books. Before everything happened, I dreamed of opening a small bookshop, a place where people could gather and discuss ideas, where children could discover the worlds I found in pages as a girl." Maxwell's expression softened. "You'd be good at that. You have a storyteller's gift. I've seen it today in how you've embellished our tale, made it believable." "Perhaps someday," Emma said wistfully. "When this is over, when I'm truly free." "You will be," Maxwell promised, and the conviction in his voice made Emma want to believe him. "Fletcher will face justice, and you'll have your chance at a new beginning." As they sat together in the fading light, their shoulders touching and their fabricated love story spreading through town like wildfire, Emma allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what such a beginning might look like: a small bookshop, perhaps in a town like Redemption, and a life no longer defined by fear. And if, in that brief fantasy, she pictured a certain gray-eyed sheriff stopping by each evening to walk her home, his hand warm around hers and his rare smile meant only for her well, that was a truth she would keep to herself, at least for now. The Grand Hotel's dining room had been transformed for the evening meal, with white tablecloths and candles lending an air of elegance to the otherwise modest establishment. Emma and Maxwell arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, her hand resting on his arm in what had become a familiar and surprisingly comfortable gesture. Emma wore the blue calico dress, which Mrs. Henderson had hastily altered that afternoon to better fit her slender frame. With her hair arranged in soft waves and secured with the ribbon Maxwell had provided, she looked every inch the radiant bride to be a transformation not lost on the diners who glanced up as they entered. "Everyone's watching us," Emma murmured, maintaining her smile despite her discomfort at being the center of attention. "Good," Maxwell replied quietly. "The more convincing our performance, the more likely Fletcher will believe you've truly found protection here, and the more likely he'll be to act rashly." They were shown to a table near the center of the room, a position that made Emma feel exposed, but that Maxwell had specifically requested. As they settled into their seats, Emma spotted Thomas Fletcher at a corner table, watching them with undisguised interest. "He's here," she said, unfolding her napkin to hide her suddenly trembling hands. "I know," Maxwell responded, his voice steady and reassuring. "Deputy Collins is stationed outside, and Mr. Holt is at the bar. You're safe." The reminder of their protection eased some of Emma's tension, though she couldn't completely shake the feeling of being prey in a hunter's sights. She focused instead on Maxwell, on the role they were playing, on the need to convince everyone, especially Thomas Fletcher, of their devotion to one another. Their meal progressed pleasantly enough, with Maxwell ordering the finest offerings the hotel kitchen could produce. They spoke softly to each other, heads inclined intimately, occasionally laughing as if sharing private jokes. To anyone observing, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed: a couple deeply in love, celebrating their engagement with a special dinner. As they were finishing their apple pie dessert, Thomas Fletcher approached their table, a glass of whiskey in his hand and that same cold smile on his lips. "Sheriff Kane, Miss Wilson," he greeted them. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Maxwell replied with convincing cordiality, though Emma felt his posture tense slightly. "Join us for a moment, Mr. Fletcher." Thomas pulled out a chair and sat without waiting for Emma's invitation, a small breach of etiquette that spoke volumes about his character. "I must say you make a striking couple. How long did you say you've been engaged, Miss Wilson?" "We didn't," Emma answered smoothly. "But Maxwell proposed last month in his last letter from Redemption." She reached across the table to take Maxwell's hand, her eyes softening as she gazed at him. "I couldn't possibly refuse the best man I've ever known." Maxwell's thumb stroked the back of her hand, his expression tender. "I'm the fortunate one," he said, his voice rough with what seemed like genuine emotion. "Finding a woman of such character and courage is rare in this world." Thomas watched their exchange with thinly veiled skepticism. "Indeed. And yet, Miss Wilson, I can't help but feel we've met before, perhaps in St. Louis. I have business interests there and visit frequently." Emma felt a chill run down her spine but maintained her composure. "I've never had the pleasure of visiting St. Louis, Mr. Fletcher. You must be confusing me with someone else." "Must I?" Thomas swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. "I have an excellent memory for faces, especially beautiful ones." "A common enough compliment," Maxwell interjected, "but my fiancée was raised in Pennsylvania and has spent the last few years in Denver. Perhaps you encountered her there." Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps. Memory can be such a curious thing." He drained his glass and stood. "I won't keep you from your celebration any longer, but I do look forward to introducing you to my brother when he arrives. He has quite an eye for recognizing people." The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable despite its polite delivery. "We'll look forward to meeting him," Maxwell replied, his expression revealing nothing of the tension Emma could feel in his hand where it still held hers. When Thomas had returned to his own table, Emma released a shaky breath. "He knows," she whispered. "He's just toying with us now." "Let him," Maxwell said confidently. "The more certain he is of your identity, the more quickly he'll send for his brother, and the sooner Fletcher arrives, the sooner this ends." They finished their meal shortly thereafter, maintaining their loving facade as they bid goodnight to the hotel staff and other diners. Outside, the night air had cooled considerably, and Maxwell removed his jacket to drape it around Emma's shoulders, a gallant gesture that was as practical as it was part of their performance. The walk back to Maxwell's cabin was brief but tense, both of them acutely aware that they might be observed. Deputy Collins followed at a discreet distance, providing security without being obvious about it. Once inside the cabin, with the door locked and curtains drawn, Emma felt some of the evening's tension drain from her body. The small space had already begun to feel familiar, almost safe, despite the danger that lurked beyond its walls. "You were magnificent tonight," Maxwell said, stoking the banked fire in the hearth to drive away the evening chill. "Even I almost believed we were engaged." Emma smiled weakly, returning his jacket. "As were you. You missed your calling as an actor." Maxwell hung his jacket on a peg by the door, his expression turning serious. "Thomas Fletcher will send word to his brother tonight. If Marcus is as close as I suspect, he could be here by tomorrow evening." "So soon?" Emma felt her momentary calm evaporate. "Are we ready?" "As ready as we can be." Maxwell moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small revolver, checking its chambers before approaching Emma. "I want you to have this." Emma stared at the weapon, hesitation clear on her face. "I've never fired a gun." "I hope you won't need to," Maxwell said, "but I'd feel better knowing you have it." He held it out to her, handle first. "It's loaded with 5 rounds. The hammer rests on an empty chamber for safety." Reluctantly, Emma took the revolver, surprised by its weight. "How do I?" "Here." Maxwell stepped behind her, his arms coming around to position her hands correctly on the weapon. "Hold it firmly but not too tight. Your index finger stays outside the trigger guard until you're ready to fire." The warmth of his body against her back, the gentle pressure of his hands guiding hers, sent a flush of heat through Emma that had nothing to do with the fire now crackling in the hearth. She was acutely aware of his breath against her ear as he continued his instructions, his deep voice resonating through her. "To fire, you cock the hammer back like this," he guided her thumb to demonstrate, "then squeeze the trigger smoothly. Don't jerk it." His hand steadied hers as she aimed at an imaginary target. "If you need to use it, don't hesitate. Aim for the center of the body, not the head or limbs." Emma nodded, trying to focus on the lesson rather than the distracting proximity of Maxwell's body. "I understand." Maxwell stepped away and Emma immediately missed his warmth. "Keep it with you at all times," he instructed, moving to check that the windows were securely latched, even here in the cabin. "Do you really think he might come here?" Emma asked, carefully placing the revolver on the table. "Fletcher is unpredictable and dangerous," Maxwell replied. "I don't think he'll make a move tonight, not until Thomas has confirmed your identity beyond doubt, but I won't take chances with your safety." The concern in his voice touched Emma deeply. Despite the artifice of their engagement, Maxwell's determination to protect her felt genuine, perhaps the most genuine thing in this web of deception they'd woven together. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this, for risking so much to help me." Maxwell turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "I should be thanking you. You've put yourself in danger to help me catch a man who's hurt many people, not just you, not just my sister." "Still," Emma persisted, "you could have simply arrested me yesterday and been done with it. Instead, you've made yourself a target alongside me." "Perhaps I saw something in you worth protecting," Maxwell said quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the room. "Something familiar." "Your sister." Emma guessed. Maxwell shook his head slowly. "No, something I recognized in myself after my parents died, the look of someone who's lost everything but refuses to be broken by it." He moved closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "You have extraordinary courage, Emma Wilson." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, warmed Emma more than the fire. "I don't feel particularly courageous. Most days I feel like I'm barely surviving." "Survival itself requires courage," Maxwell countered, "especially when the easier path would be surrender." They stood in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote the only sounds in the small cabin. Something had shifted between them. Emma realized something deeper than their pretend engagement, more significant than their alliance against a common enemy. "I should go," Maxwell finally said, breaking the spell. "The later I leave, the more convincing our charade will be to any watching eyes." Emma nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Will you come back in the morning, at first light?" he promised. "Bolt the door behind me, and remember what I taught you about the revolver." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. For a moment, Emma thought he might say something more, might acknowledge the tension that had been building between them all day. Instead, he simply nodded and slipped out into the night, leaving Emma alone with the fire, the revolver, and thoughts that wandered down dangerous paths. As she bolted the door and prepared for bed, Emma tried to sort through her conflicting emotions. Fear of Fletcher's imminent arrival warred with a growing trust in Maxwell's ability to protect her. Relief at having found an ally after months alone battled with anxiety about the danger they faced together. And beneath it all, a current of attraction to Maxwell Kane that she could no longer deny, an attraction made all the more complicated by their pretense, by the uncertainty of their future once Fletcher was captured, by the very real possibility that one or both of them might not survive the coming confrontation. In the bedroom, Emma changed into the nightgown Mrs. Henderson had included among the supplies, the revolver placed carefully on the nightstand within easy reach. As she slipped beneath the quilt, the scent of pine and leather that she now associated with Maxwell surrounded her from the bedding. Sleep was long in coming, her mind replaying every touch, every look, every word exchanged with Maxwell throughout the day. How much had been performance? How much had been real? And did it matter, when tomorrow might bring Marcus Fletcher to redemption, and with him a reckoning that could end in blood? When Emma finally drifted off, her dreams were a confused tangle of pursuing shadows, protective arms, and storm-gray eyes that saw through every pretense to the truth of her heart. Dawn broke with a thunderstorm, rain lashing against the cabin windows and thunder rolling across the valley. Emma had been awake for hours, sleep having abandoned her in the pre-dawn darkness when distant lightning first illuminated the room. She sat in the rocking chair by the fire, wrapped in a quilt, the revolver within reach on a small table beside her. The storm matched her turbulent thoughts, anxiety about Fletcher's possible arrival today, confusion about her growing feelings for Maxwell, uncertainty about what would happen when their charade ended. Where would she go? What would she do? For the first time in months, Emma allowed herself to consider a future beyond mere survival. The agreed-upon knock 3 raps, a pause, then 2 more startled her from her reverie. She grabbed the revolver, approaching the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called, though she knew the answer. "It's me," Maxwell's voice replied, muffled by the door and the drumming rain. Emma slid back the bolt and opened the door to find Maxwell standing on the threshold, rain dripping from his hat and coat. His expression was grim as he stepped inside, removing his sodden outerwear and hanging it by the fire to dry. "Any trouble in the night?" he asked, eyeing the revolver still clutched in her hand. Emma shook her head, setting the weapon aside. "No, just the storm." Maxwell nodded, running a hand through his damp hair. "Good. I spoke with Deputy Collins this morning. Thomas Fletcher sent a rider out late last night, heading east presumably to contact his brother. Then Marcus could arrive today," Emma said, voicing the fear that had kept her awake. "It's possible, though the storm may slow him down." Maxwell moved to the stove, pouring coffee from the pot Emma had prepared earlier. "Either way, we need to be ready." "What happens when he comes?" Emma asked, wrapping the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "What's our plan?" Maxwell sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Fletcher is too smart to make a direct move against you in public, especially now that the town believes you're under my protection. He'll likely approach through Thomas, perhaps attempt to separate us first. And when that fails, he'll grow desperate. That's when he'll make a mistake." Maxwell's confidence was unwavering. "I have Deputy Collins and Holt watching the roads into town. The moment Fletcher arrives, I'll know it." Emma nodded, trying to draw strength from Maxwell's certainty. "What should I do today? Act normally? Continue our charade?" Maxwell set down his cup and approached her, his expression softening. "I know you're frightened, Emma. You have every right to be, but I meant what I said yesterday. I won't let any harm come to you." His proximity, the sincerity in his voice, the warmth in his eyes all combined to make Emma's heart race. Without thinking, she reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the scar along his jawline. "I believe you," she said softly. Maxwell went very still beneath her touch, his eyes darkening with an emotion Emma couldn't quite name. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean in, might close the small distance between them. Instead, he gently caught her hand and lowered it, though he didn't immediately release it. "We should prepare for the day," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Despite the storm, people will expect to see us together." Emma nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "I'll get dressed." The day passed in a strange blur of tension and pretense. They ventured out despite the rain, visiting the church to discuss wedding arrangements with the pastor, who seemed thrilled at the prospect of officiating the sheriff's nuptials. Stopping at the dressmaker's to order a simple wedding gown, sharing lunch at the hotel where Thomas Fletcher watched them with undisguised suspicion. Throughout it all, Maxwell remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings even as he played the role of devoted fiancé. His hand rarely left Emma's elbow or the small of her back, his body positioned to shield her from potential threats. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving puddles in the rutted streets and a fresh, clean scent in the air. As they walked from the general store, where Maxwell had purchased supplies for dinner, Deputy Collins approached, his expression tense. "Sheriff," he said quietly, tipping his hat to Emma. "Rider coming in from the east, matches the description." Maxwell's hand tightened momentarily on Emma's arm. "How far?" "10 minutes, maybe less." "Take positions," Maxwell instructed. "Signal halt." "I want eyes on him the moment he enters town." Collins nodded and hurried away, leaving Emma and Maxwell standing in the middle of the wet street. "He's here," Emma whispered, fear constricting her throat. Maxwell turned to her, his eyes intense. "This is what we've been waiting for, Emma. Stay calm, follow my lead. Remember you have the revolver." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the weapon in her pocket. "Yes, good." Maxwell glanced around, noting the relatively empty street, most townsfolk still indoors after the storm. "Listen carefully. When Fletcher arrives, he'll likely go to the hotel first to meet with Thomas. I want you to return to the cabin." "No," Emma interrupted firmly. "I won't hide while you confront him. This is my fight too." Maxwell frowned. "Emma, Fletcher is dangerous, so am I when cornered," she countered. "You said it yourself, I have courage. Let me use it." Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Maxwell nodded, a reluctant respect in his expression. "All right, but you stay by my side no matter what happens. No heroics, no separate confrontations. Promise me." "I promise," Emma agreed, relief flooding through her. After months of running, the thought of facing Fletcher, of ending this nightmare once and for all, filled her with a strange, fierce determination. They continued their walk back toward Maxwell's cabin, their pace more measured now, both hyper-aware of their surroundings. Emma could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, her mouth dry with anticipation and fear. They had just reached the edge of town when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A lone rider appeared on the east road, his figure silhouetted against the clearing sky, a tall man on a black horse, moving with the confidence of someone who owned the very ground beneath him. Even at a distance, Emma recognized him instantly. Marcus Fletcher had found her at last. "There he is," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maxwell's arm went around her waist, a gesture that to observers would appear loving but that Emma recognized as protective. "Stay calm," he murmured against her hair. "Let him make the first move." They watched as Fletcher rode directly to the hotel, dismounting with fluid grace and handing the reins to a stable boy. He paused on the boardwalk, surveying the town as if assessing a property he intended to purchase. When his gaze found Emma and Maxwell, a cold smile spread across his handsome face. Even from a distance, Emma could see that he hadn't changed. The same immaculate attire, despite days of travel, the same perfectly groomed dark hair and mustache, the same cold eyes that had haunted her nightmares for months. He tipped his hat in their direction, a mocking gesture, before disappearing into the hotel. "He saw us," Emma said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Good," Maxwell replied. "Now he knows exactly where to find you and who stands between him and his objective." As they continued toward the cabin, Emma felt a curious calm settling over her. After months of running, of looking over her shoulder, of waking in the night at every sound, the moment of confrontation had finally arrived. Whatever happened next, at least the waiting was over. What she couldn't have anticipated was how the presence of Maxwell Kane at her side would transform her fear into resolve, or how the thought of protecting him, as much as being protected by him, would steel her nerves for the coming storm. Marcus Fletcher had come to claim her, just as he had promised in his threatening letters. But Emma Wilson was no longer the frightened, isolated woman who had fled St. Louis in the night. She had found an ally, a protector, perhaps even something more, in the gray-eyed sheriff who walked beside her now, his face set in determined lines as they prepared to make their stand together. Evening descended on Redemption with unusual stillness, as if the town itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Emma and Maxwell had returned to his cabin, ostensibly to prepare dinner, but in reality to finalize their strategy for the inevitable confrontation with Fletcher. "He'll wait until nightfall," Maxwell predicted, checking and rechecking his revolver. "Fletcher prefers to operate in shadows." Emma nodded, her own weapon a reassuring weight in the pocket of her dress. "Will he come here, to the cabin?" "Not initially," Maxwell replied, his expression thoughtful. "He's too careful for that. He'll try to separate us first or create a situation where taking you wouldn't raise immediate alarm." They had barely finished their simple meal of beans and biscuits when a knock sounded at the door, not Maxwell's coded signal, but a firm, confident rap that made Emma's blood run cold. Maxwell motioned for her to stay seated as he approached the door, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. "Who is it?" he called, his voice betraying none of the tension Emma could see in his stance. "Thomas Fletcher, Sheriff," came the reply. "I apologize for the intrusion, but my brother insists on extending an invitation to you and your lovely fiancée." Maxwell glanced at Emma, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, her hand slipping into her pocket to touch the revolver. "One moment, Mr. Fletcher," Maxwell called, moving back to Emma's side. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. "Yes," Emma replied with more confidence than she felt. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes, pride perhaps, or a deeper emotion he couldn't express. He squeezed her hand briefly before returning to open the door. Thomas Fletcher stood on the threshold, impeccably dressed despite the late hour. "Sheriff, Miss Wilson," he greeted them with an oily smile. "My brother has taken a private dining room at the hotel and requests the pleasure of your company this evening." "How thoughtful," Maxwell replied dryly. "May I ask the occasion?" Thomas's smile didn't waver. "A celebration of sorts." "My brother is quite eager to renew his acquaintance with your fiancée." The implication hung in the air between them, a barely veiled threat beneath the polite words. "We'd be delighted," Emma said before Maxwell could respond, rising from her chair with a composure that surprised even her. "Wouldn't we, darling?" Maxwell's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts as he nodded. "Of course, allow us a few minutes to prepare." "By all means," Thomas agreed smoothly. "I'll wait outside." When the door closed, Maxwell turned to Emma with concern etched on his features. "Are you certain about this? We could force him to come to us on our terms." "No," Emma said firmly. "This is our opportunity. Fletcher will be overconfident in the hotel, believing he has the advantage. Let him think he's lured us into his trap." A ghost of a smile touched Maxwell's lips. "While in fact he's walking into ours." Emma nodded, reaching for her shawl. "Exactly. Deputy Collins and Holt will be positioned near the hotel," Maxwell informed her, checking his weapon one last time before holstering it. "At the first sign of trouble, they'll move in." As Emma arranged her shawl around her shoulders, Maxwell stepped closer, his expression suddenly serious. "Emma," he said quietly, "before we go, there's something I need to say." The intensity in his voice made her heart skip a beat. "Yes." Maxwell hesitated, seeming to search for words. "If anything happens tonight, if something goes wrong." He paused, then continued with quiet determination. "I want you to know that this past day, this pretense between us hasn't been entirely pretense for me." The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and powerful. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat as Maxwell's storm-gray eyes held hers, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Nor for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, relief, perhaps, or the release of a tension he had been holding. Without further words, he reached out to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. The tenderness in his touch made Emma's heart race. For a suspended moment, Emma thought he might kiss her, hoped he would kiss her. Instead, Maxwell stepped back, his hand falling reluctantly to his side. "When this is over," he promised softly, "we'll have time to discover what's real between us." The promise warmed Emma even as the reminder of the danger ahead sobered her. "Then let's finish it," she said with newfound resolve. "Tonight." Maxwell nodded, offering his arm in what had become their familiar gesture. Emma took it, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. Together, they opened the door to where Thomas Fletcher waited, impatience evident in his stance. "Shall we?" Maxwell said calmly, his other hand resting casually near his holster. The walk to the hotel seemed both interminable and too brief. Night had fully fallen, the streets of Redemption illuminated only by the occasional lantern and the silver glow of a rising moon. Emma was acutely aware of Thomas Fletcher walking slightly ahead of them, of Maxwell's protective presence at her side, of the curious glances from the few townspeople still about at this hour. The Grand Hotel was unusually busy, the saloon portion doing brisk business with locals and travelers alike. Thomas led them past the main dining room toward a private parlor at the rear of the building. As they approached, Emma's steps faltered slightly. Maxwell's hand immediately covered hers where it rested on his arm, a silent reassurance that gave her the courage to continue. Thomas knocked once on the parlor door before opening it with a flourish. "Sheriff Kane and Miss Wilson, as requested," he announced, gesturing for them to enter. The private dining room was well appointed by frontier standards, a polished table set for four, candles casting a warm glow over fine china and crystal that must have been specially procured for the occasion. At the head of the table stood Marcus Fletcher, every bit as imposing as Emma remembered. "Sheriff Kane," Fletcher greeted Maxwell with practiced charm, his voice cultured and smooth. "How kind of you to accept my invitation." His cold eyes shifted to Emma, a predatory gleam in their depths. "And Miss Wilson, a genuine pleasure to see you again." The pretense was dropped so quickly that Emma almost laughed. No charade of mistaken identity, no polite fiction about a first meeting, just the immediate acknowledgement that he had found his quarry at last. "Mr. Fletcher," Maxwell replied evenly, his posture relaxed but alert. "I understand you've been looking for my fiancée for some time." Fletcher's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Fiancée? How? Unexpected. When my brother informed me of your engagement, I confess I was surprised." Miss Wilson made no mention of a sheriff awaiting her when she so abruptly departed St. Louis. "Perhaps because we hadn't yet met," Maxwell countered smoothly. "Fate works in mysterious ways." "Indeed it does," Fletcher agreed, gesturing to the table. "Please sit. I've arranged for the hotel's finest offerings. We have much to discuss." Emma felt Maxwell's brief hesitation before he guided her to a chair, seating her before taking the place beside her. Thomas Fletcher took the seat opposite them, leaving Marcus at the head of the table, a position of authority he clearly relished. A waiter appeared with wine, pouring generous measures into the crystal glasses before disappearing with a nod from Fletcher. The four of them sat in tense silence until the door closed behind the servant. "To new acquaintances," Fletcher proposed, raising his glass in a mocking toast. "And old debts." Emma left her glass untouched, as did Maxwell. Fletcher noted their abstention with a slight narrowing of his eyes but continued undeterred. "Sheriff Kane, I find myself in an awkward position," he began, setting down his wine. "You see, Miss Wilson and I have unfinished business in St. Louis, business of a personal nature." Any business you had with Miss Wilson concluded when she declined your proposal, Maxwell replied firmly. A decision every woman has the right to make for herself. Fletcher's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into practiced affability. Ah, so she's told you about our misunderstanding. I assure you, Sheriff, Miss Wilson exaggerates the situation. We had an understanding, she and I, a commitment that she abandoned rather precipitously. That's not true, Emma said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. There was never any commitment, Marcus. I refused your proposal clearly and repeatedly. Fletcher's gaze fixed on her, cold and calculating. You were confused, my dear. Overwhelmed by the prospect of joining a family of our standing, your reluctance was merely nerves, which I was prepared to overlook. And when she fled rather than marry you, Maxwell asked, his voice deceptively casual, was that also merely nerves? A flash of anger crossed Fletcher's face before he mastered it. Miss Wilson found herself in some difficulty in St. Louis. Allegations of impropriety, rumors about her character, unfortunate circumstances that made her position untenable. I merely wish to offer her protection from such scandals. Scandals you created, Emma countered, her voice stronger now. Lies you spread when I wouldn't submit to your demands. Thomas Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting between his brother and the couple across the table. Emma realized with sudden clarity that Thomas was nervous, perhaps even afraid of how this confrontation might unfold. This grows tiresome, Marcus Fletcher said dismissively. The fact remains, Miss Wilson, that you have obligations in St. Louis that remain unfulfilled. I've come to escort you back to fulfill them. My fiancé isn't going anywhere with you, Fletcher, Maxwell stated firmly, his hand moving to cover Emma's on the table, a gesture both protective and possessive. Whatever game you're playing ends now. Fletcher's facade of civility slipped further, his eyes hardening to chips of ice. I think not, Sheriff. You see, I never lose. Not a business deal, not a legal case, and certainly not a woman I've set my sights on. There's a first time for everything, Emma countered boldly, feeling Maxwell's support steady her resolve. You may have had power in St. Louis, Marcus, but here you have none. Marcus leaned forward, a dangerous smile curling his lips. Power's a fickle thing, my dear, and it can shift in an instant. He turned to Maxwell, his icy demeanor shifting to one of thinly veiled menace. You might consider the consequences of standing between me and what I want. Maxwell's gaze didn't waver. And you might consider how many have tried before you and where they are now. The atmosphere crackled with tension as the adversaries stared each other down, both men aware that their next moves could reshape everything.